Hello and welcome to this presentation. My name is Maysam Rabbani and today I will be talking about my job market paper titled Mergers with Future Rivals, a Pharmaceutical Entry Barrier. As of now, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, and in summer 2021, I have graduated from the University of South Florida with a PhD in health economics. In this paper, which is a working paper that is um, almost wrapped up, almost done, and ready to be submitted, I will be talking about a loophole in antitrust enforcement that has been previously identified but never empirically tested and shown. So the main objective of this presentation is to provide evidence, empirical evidence, for the FTC statement that mergers between incumbents and future rivals can be anti-competitive. For the first time in 2010, the Federal Trade Commission recognized the possibility that mergers between incumbents and future rivals can be welfare decreasing by postponing price reductions and competitions that could have been achieved, or even adding to the current prices by eliminating the threat of entry. And then I will argue that this creates a very significant loophole that can potentially incapacitate antitrust enforcement, at least in the pharmaceutical industry and a few other industries. To give it a little background, every time mergers are signed and go through, there is a chance that the Federal Trade Commission initiates an investigation to challenge or deny mergers, and it primarily depends on the effect of the merger on the market concentration in the form of the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or the HHI. If a merger adds to the HHI by more than 200 units and the post-merger HHI goes beyond 2,500 units, there is a chance that the FTC initiates an investigation. But if either of the two conditions is violated, the chances for the FTC to win the case are slim, and the FTC would not consider challenging the merger. The issue is that this approach is unable to capture the harm caused by mergers between incumbents and future rivals because by definition, these mergers leave the HHI intact, and the FTC has no chance using this approach to show the harm. The FTC has recognized the possibility of the harm, as I mentioned, but the FTC has never used it in litigation. In fact, as I will mention later, there were 3 cases of this nature. The FTC never leveraged this dimension or this statement in the merger litigation in those cases because the FTC just doesn't have the empirical evidence for that. The FTC has not done the research, and there is no paper in the literature confirming or validating this FTC statement. So essentially what this paper is doing is to look at a pharmaceutical merger between Gilead Sciences and Pharmaset and provide empirical evidence for what the FTC has already stated. And to do so, I'm looking at this merger and the effect of this merger on drug utilization and drug prices in the markets that Gilead has been present. We can take a look at the event study of this merger. In each of these panels, the vertical line, the vertical dashed line, is the time the merger went through, and the blue dots are monthly averages for the average wholesale price, retail price, and the number of pills sold. I normalized the AWP and retail price by the number of pills just to make it a little more comparable across people, across drugs, across drug package sizes, of course. And to make it easier to see the effect of the merger or to compare after the merger versus before the merger, you can see that a non-vertical line is fit in the pre-merger period and then projected in the post-merger period. So looking at the AWP, there's a market increase in the prices for Gilead, and then the rivals are gradually losing or lowering their average wholesale prices over time. A similar trend is found in the retail prices for Gilead, and a similar trend for the rivals of Gilead. I will talk about the definition of the rivals later. And in terms of the quantity of sales, Gilead has been gradually increasing their sales, and they continued on the steady growth line both before and after the merger, but Gilead's rivals start losing market share, which becomes a little more clear to see sometime in June and July 2012. And quantitative tests that are not reported in the presentation, they are part of the paper, confirm that the effect on utilization, the effect on the quantity measures kicks in June 2012, and that's the time I will be using for the treatment for the quantity measures. Excuse me. So to take a look at some of the highlights of the results, after this merger, the DID model that I will be using, the difference in difference model that I will be using, indicates that Gilead increased the average wholesale prices by $4.15 per pill, and it was reciprocated by a $6 increase in the retail prices. And alongside that, Gilead managed to sell 20%, a 20% larger quantity of pills. This finding, well, in the paper, I talk about 6 or 7 contributions to the literature that are relevant and significant on their own right. But for the purpose of this presentation, I would like to have put all the emphasis on one main finding, that the FTC statement is correct. Mergers between incumbents and future rivals can lead to major, economically large, and statistically significant increases in the prices even at the time of the merger, long before the newcomer is expected to enter the market. And it's an important finding and it hints to a loophole. It creates a loophole that can disable antitrust enforcement to a large extent, because if the incumbents are free to take over the future rivals as they wish, and if they do so smartly and consistently, they can deter entry to the market indefinitely, because they can scout for the future rivals, find the promising ones, negotiate a price for them to be bought out, and keep competition out. This process can go on and on indefinitely, and competition potentially would be never achieved. And that's why this finding can be very significant in the pharmaceutical industry. And as I will show you, it has implications for the software industry and certain other industries. This is the outline of the presentation. I will be talking about the literature a little bit. Then I will talk about the specifics of this merger, the data and model. I will go over the results. We will spend a lot of time in the results part, because alongside the baseline results, I will try to show you multiple other dimensions of this merger to first test the robustness of the findings, and second, draw certain other conclusions that are relevant to the pharmaceutical industry. And then we will conclude. If you want to know more about the literature on pharmaceuticals from an economic standpoint in general, Lactavala 2018 does a wonderful job, and I encourage you to take a look at that paper. To my surprise, not anywhere else in the literature, there is a single word on pharmaceutical measures. Primarily, it should be a data limitation, because it's hard to find the specifics of the actual payments for the drugs before and after mergers. And lacking that data, there seems to be a general trend in the literature to work on topics that are easier to do with limited data, including product hopping, settlements, and direct-to-consumer advertisement. These topics are a little different from the topic at hand, so I skipped that part of the conversation. But since I didn't find a convenient point to connect this work to the literature, because there is no literature of pharmaceutical mergers, I went over the FTC website and I went over all the mergers that they have litigated over the past two and a half decades, and I made 2 observations. One, the FTC has never challenged a merger between an incumbent and a future rival. So the FTC has not used this statement in action. And two, I found three mergers that the FTC has challenged, three mergers between two incumbents that each of them had some dimension of future rivalry being killed in the process, but the FTC has never leveraged killing future competition as evidence of harm in those cases for the reasons that I discussed in the past. And it speaks to the relevance and importance of giving the FTC the edge or empirical evidence for the statement that they have made, but they have never had the chance to use in litigation. The merger that I'm looking at took place in 2012 between Gilead Sciences and Pharmaceutical. At the time of the merger, Gilead was a dominant firm in three drug markets, primarily in the antiviral drug market. Gilead had 5 branded drugs in antiviral market, including the Tripla, Truvada, Viret, Hepzera, and Emtriva. And Gilead was also active with 2 other branded or patented drugs in cardiac and vasodilating drug markets, including Renexa and Letairis. Pharmaceutical was at the time, Pharmaceutical wasn't marketing any drugs at the time of the merger, but Pharmaceutical was expected to enter the antiviral drug market with 3 strong drugs: Sovaldi for hepatitis C, Levovir for hepatitis B, and Rasavir for HIV. Sovaldi eventually entered the market. It was approved in December 2013 and entered the market in January 2014. Levovir and Rasavir never entered the market. Even though Levovir and Rasavir showed a lot of promise, they were in phase 2 clinical trials. They showed improved efficacy. They showed no special side effects. And they seemed to be getting ready to enter the market as new and improved drugs. After the merger, Gilead abandoned them. Gilead discarded them. Gilead never pursued FDA approval for them, and Gilead never reported any reasons for doing so. And most likely these are, or I would say potentially, these are killer acquisition instances. Killer acquisition is a term coined by Cunningham and colleagues in 2019. They showed that when a large incumbent pharmaceutical purchases a smaller pharmaceutical that has drugs in development, those drugs in the pipeline are likely to be discarded and abandoned after the merger, especially if those drugs overlap the existing portfolio of the incumbent and the incumbent is happy with the revenues of their existing portfolio, which seems to be a good fit for the existing scenario because Gilead's HIV and HBV portfolio was doing a massively great job in terms of generating revenues. And they just didn't probably need to undergo lengthy and costly FDA approvals to add Levovir and Rasavir to the pipeline. The data sets that I'm using for this study are twofold. I'm using IBM Watson Truven Market Scan pharmaceutical claims data as the main data set that gives me the specifics of the drug markets. It is a panel data set that is representative of privately insured Americans. It tracks the individuals over time. And in the pharmaceutical claims part, every time one of those individuals is using their health insurance to fill a prescription, all the relevant details are being captured, including the drug details, brand name, drug name, the number of units sold, quantity, dosage, strength. And on the top of that, the dataset also reports the amount paid by the insurer and the amount paid by the patient to the retail pharmacy. And it also reports the average wholesale price. So just to be clear, one of the main advantages of this data set is that it doesn't report imputed, estimated, imprecise measures of payment. These are actual payments made before and after the merger. And to incorporate demographics and socioeconomic background, I'm using the American Community Survey for the same years. And overall, I'm borrowing 69 variables from the American Community Survey to the study just to make sure I'm minimizing and controlling as much as possible for the socioeconomic characteristics. Here we can take a look at the summary statistics. Some of the variables actually are reported here. Some are reported on the following pages. But I want to pay a lot of attention to the first 5 variables at the top, because these are going to be the dependent variables in the regression analysis. It includes the average wholesale price, AWP, retail price, and the out-of-pocket payments, OOP. And just to make the analysis comparable across observations and independent of the package sizes, I divide AWP price and OOP by the number of pills filled in the prescription. So these numbers are per pill. And I'm also introducing 2 quantitative measures, the daily number of pills sold and the daily number of prescriptions filled. And the market scan data is also reporting a good list of explanatory variables for me, including patient age, binaries for insurance plan type, whether the person using the insurance plan is the main enrollee or a dependent, and the purpose of the drug. These are some of the variables that I'm using from the American Community Survey. As you see, most of them are economic measures, some are demographic backgrounds, and there is a host of other variables that I'm using and implementing in the regression model as explanatory variables, but they are not reported in the table just for conciseness. It includes measures of education, race, ethnicity, occupation, industry, work class, marital status, age group, and measures of family income. I'm using a difference in difference identification as the main specification. I'm comparing pre-merger versus post-merger, and I'm comparing Gilead drugs versus the generic drugs active in the same therapeutic classes. And of course, the difference in difference model is valid if the parallel trends assumption is valid. And in the paper, I go over the specifics of a quantitative test for the parallel trends assumption, which is compellingly and conveniently satisfied in this case. And so I'm using the difference in differences strategy. You can take a look at the model details and specifics in this equation format. I have the natural logarithm of each of the 5 dependent variables on the left, and I'm taking natural logarithms just to make it a little more linear. And then I have time invariant and time variant characteristics. I have a binary for post-merger, and I have the interaction term. And epsilon is the error term in this model. And of course, beta 2 serves as the difference in difference coefficient of interest. And in the tables that will follow, I will be reporting beta 2, and in some of them, I'm reporting beta 1. So just keep in mind that I'm reporting beta 1 and beta 2, and beta 2 is the focus of the attention because beta 2 is the difference in difference coefficient of interest. This is the baseline results. We have 5 columns, and in each column, the difference in difference coefficients are reported for one of the 5 dependent variables. Reading the coefficients for beta 2, reading this row, essentially the story is to say, compared to the control group and after the merger, Gilead increased the average wholesale prices by more than 10%, and it has led to a large increase in the retail prices, which has led to a proportionate increase in the out-of-pocket payments. And on the top of that, Gilead managed to sell more than 18% in terms of, Gilead managed to increase the sales by more than 18% in terms of the quantity of sales. So I want to make 3 points based on this table. The first and foremost is it confirms the FTC statement that mergers between incumbents and future rivals can lead to large and immediate price increases, which is in line and exactly what the FTC predicted. Second, looking at columns 1 to 3, the coefficients for beta 2 in columns 1 to 3, we can provide a relatively complete picture of the effect of the merger on the entire supply chain of pharmaceuticals. What happens is there is a large and immediate increase in the average wholesale prices after the merger, and then it trickles down and passes through to affect the retail pharmacies. They raise the prices, and then the cost increase is shared proportionately by the insurer and the patient. So we have an immediate, large, and complete pass-through of the effect of the merger through the entire supply chain of drugs. And the last point is about the increasing the quantity of sales. As we know, looking at the law of demand, assuming a downward slope demand curve and upward slope supply curve, every time the price goes up, we are expecting the utilization to go down. But here we see an increase in the prices alongside a large increase in the quantity of sales. I believe, even though it is not empirically tested, there is anecdotal evidence that this is because of a marketing attempt by Gilead that took place alongside the merger. There's anecdotal evidence, again, detailed in the paper, that after the merger, Gilead substantially increased the marketing expenditures. And it makes sense, because if the prices increase after the merger, then the marginal profitability of advertisement would increase, which would justify for Gilead to spend more on advertisement. And if Gilead spends more on advertisement, the sales would soar in terms of the quantity. And that's exactly what we are looking at. So that is to say, price is directly affected by the merger, and quantity is indirectly affected by the merger through the merger justifying the increase in the marketing expenditures. Although the latter one is just a speculation based on anecdotal evidence. Now that we're done with the baseline model, let's go over some different variations of looking at the same problem from different levels and aspects. On this page, we're looking at the effect of the measure on the same 5 dependent variables, but this time we're looking at therapeutic classes separately, drug markets separately. So in one panel, we're looking at the effect of the measure on antiviral drugs, in the other on the cardiac drugs, and in the last one, we're looking at the effect of the measure in the vasodilating drug market. The reason I'm doing this is that Pharmacet was going to be a future competitor in the antiviral drug market. And so if the causality statement that I'm trying to establish, if the causality between the merger and the effects that I'm observing in the market is true, is there, then I either should see effects specifically in the antiviral drug market, or I should see the largest effects in the antiviral drug market. And looking at the numbers, I can confirm that the largest price increases took place in the antiviral drug market, and the antiviral drug market is the only market that has a statistically significant increase in sales, which is consistent with the causality statement, which is consistent with the notion that since most of the sales of Gilead has been in the antiviral drug market, Gilead's marketing attempts have been targeting the antiviral drug market for the most part, leading to an increase in the sales in this market. But alongside confirming or reinforcing the causality statement, this page is also showing evidence of a spillover effect. So the merger was meant to affect the antiviral drug market, but we do see evidence that the merger to a smaller extent has affected the other drug markets in which Gilead has been present, which is confirming the presence of a spillover effect. I'll get back to this point and we will be talking about the implications of the spillover effect a little later. Now let's repeat the process, this time Let's look at the effect of the merger on one of the 7 Gilead drugs at a time. So Gilead was marketing 7 drugs, and in each of these rows, the treated group is limited to one of those 7 drugs, and the control group is kept the same. The reason I'm doing so is to see how similar is the effect on the different drugs of Gilead. If the effect is largely different, for example, if I see large increases for some of the drugs and no increases for the other drugs, then one might argue that it wasn't the result of the merger. It was something specific to that drug, something like a surge in the demand, a shortage of inputs in certain markets, a new discovery of new possibilities of treatment specific to one market and so on. And if that is true, then it would weaken the idea of the causality. But if the effect, in contrast, is more or less the same, if the effect is approximately similar for all Gilead drugs, it would reinforce the causality statement, because it would suggest that the reason behind the change is something endemic to Gilead and potentially something related to a managerial decision that has affected all Gilead drugs in the same way. And as we look at the numbers, you can confirm that the latter case is the case. That is to say, the effect is more or less the same for all Gilead drugs, and each of these rows would suffice to replicate the baseline results, especially in columns 1, 2, 3, which reinforces the causality statement, which reinforces the idea that the cause has been a managerial decision, a firm level decision taken in Gilead. Now let's take a look at the effect, this time separately reported for each of the insurance plan types. I have preferred provider organizations, point of service, health maintenance organizations, consumer-driven health plans, and high-deductible health plans. Again, looking at this page, I'm trying to test the causality of the relationship, because if the causality statement is true, if the merger is the cause for the changes in the prices and utilization that we see, then we know that mergers affect markets by distorting market power and market concentration. And we know that different insurance plan types respond differently to changes in provider market concentration. To be more specific, health maintenance organizations are known to be of larger scale, and they are known to aggressively and strongly leverage their market power and market size against providers. So if the channel of effect is through a change in the market power of the providers, health maintenance organizations are the insurance plan types that should resist it the most. And the price increase should be the smallest for health maintenance organizations. And that's exactly what we see in the table. The smallest numbers are reported for health maintenance organizations compared to the others, which reinforces the idea that whatever the cause has been behind the scene, it has passed through a change and distortion in the market power of potentially the pharmaceutical firms. And the other interesting point here to mention is the effect on utilization. If the changes in the utilization are influenced by the changes in the prices, then the effect should be different for each insurance plan type, depending on how sensitive the patients in those insurance plan types are to the prices, or how exposed to the prices are the patients on those plans. And we know that preferred provider organizations are the most generous insurance plan type. They provide the most cost insulation for their enrollees. And so if there is a distortion in utilization that is caused by a price change, PPO patients should feel it the least, and PPO patients should be the least price sensitive. And that's exactly what we see here. The largest increase in the quantity took place for the PPOs, potentially because of the aforementioned reason, which again argues about the indirect effect of the merger on the quantity of on the utilization that goes through the marketing attempts. Up to this point, all the arguments, all the reasoning was to say mergers between incumbents and future rivals can be welfare decreasing. And this way, or the way I'm narrating the story, it seems to be endemic to the pharmaceutical market, because the pharmaceutical industry is the only industry in which we have the Food and Drug Administration. We have the FDA that delays entry to drug markets by a few up to a couple of years, giving enough time to the incumbents to look at the newcomers, approach them, offer them a price to buy them out. And this mechanism is unique to the pharmaceuticals. But on this page, I want to argue that the findings go beyond the pharmaceutical market, and a different version of the same loophole exists, at least in the software industry. Let's take a look at this table. We have 3 instances of mergers that took place in 2005 and 2006 in the software industry. So Facebook purchased Instagram for $1 billion, and Google purchased Android and YouTube for $50 million and $1.65 billion. And the same companies, Instagram, Android, and YouTube, are estimated to be worth $150 and $300 billion today. And to put the numbers in the perspective of the entire industry, the whole software industry is estimated to be worth $1.8 trillion today. So the actual payments for those mergers were so small that the change in the HHI in the entire industry was essentially non-existent, negligible. But if the same measures were to take place today with these numbers, then they would most likely warrant a FTC litigation, given how they would distort the market concentration. But it didn't happen because the incumbents purchased the rivals before they grow to their capacities and potentials. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. A different version of the loophole that I described in the pharmaceutical industry applies to the software industry. And that version is about mergers between incumbents, large dominant incumbents on the one hand, and small but promising future rivals on the other hand, whose future trajectory of growth is sufficiently and reliably predictable. And if that is the case, then the incumbents can take over those small promising firms before they become, a big deal, a contender. And these measures can fly under the regulator's radar just because they took place before the fringe firms mature to their actual size. And there is a literature wonderfully documented in the work of Cabral in 2018 and a few others, showing that this version of the loophole, the way I described it, has been taken advantage of by the software industry giants since the 80s. And there are numerous examples, not just from Google and Facebook, but also from Amazon, Microsoft, Intel, and some other rivals of them, showing that this has been going on for a long time in the software industry. And that is a reliable mechanism that the software industry giants have been using to deter entry and hold on to their market dominance in the software industry. There are several robustness tricks that I discuss in the paper, but for the interest of time, I don't discuss them in the presentation. It's just to say I have looked at a variety of different dimensions to check the robustness of the results, and all of them are confirming that the results remain statistically significant and economically large upon doing all these model alterations. And in conclusion, what this paper tries to say is, first and most importantly, the FTC statement is true that mergers between incumbents and future rivals can largely incapacitate antitrust enforcement. And in the paper, I offer a solution. I go through the steps and mechanisms to describe the solution, but in a nutshell, here is the solution. Every time there is a merger between an incumbent and a future rival, the FTC should discard the standard approach to merger analysis, and instead, the FTC needs to form a counterfactual analysis in which the merger is delayed for long enough so that the future rival actually enters the market and grows to its potential, and then the merger takes place. And so it is to say the FTC should form this counterfactual, let the merger happen at a future time, and look at the effect of the merger in that future time, in that counterfactual analysis, because if you let the future rival to enter the market, grow to its potential, then the effect on the HHI and market concentration would be evident. And that's the point that the FTC should emphasize to show the harm. And the third point is that according to the spillover effect that I documented, it seems like the way the FTC is delineating the relevant market is too narrow to capture the true harm of mergers. At least in this case, if the FTC were to do the analysis, they would most likely focus on the antiviral drug market as the relevant market. And as the evidence shows, Gilead has benefited from the same merger to raise the prices in the other markets. So potentially, the FTC is underestimating the actual harm of mergers by defining a relevant market in a too narrow fashion. And the last point is that the finding is not limited to the pharmaceutical industry. It's at least applicable to the software industry and potentially to many other industries in which there are large dominant incumbents that consistently take over small fringe firms that show promise of growth. And this concludes the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. I would love to hear from you. I would like to know your feedback, your comments, your thoughts, your criticisms. So feel free to reach out to me using either of my two email addresses. Thank you very much.